Historical fiction? Yes. My epic fantasy that is my baby project right now originally started out as a historical fiction, specifically historical fantasy. And it has always been one of my favorite genres because I love history. I love it. It's always been my favorite subject in school. And eventually, I will be writing historical fantasy that will be linked to my epic fantasy now, like in the same universe kind of thing, because this time of year is my absolute favorite time of year to read historical fiction, as I am currently doing. I figured this would be a great time to nerd out and share with you guys some things that I have realized as I have worked on some of my own historical fiction writings. Things that I didn't necessarily think of or think very deeply on before starting my own projects. So, I'm really excited to get into this with you guys. Let's go. Tip number 1. Know your subgenre. Historical fiction is kind of an umbrella genre, right? Within that, there can be either romance, mystery, thriller, drama, fantasy, right? All falling under some type of historical fiction. This is not the same as like your secondary plot. This is specifically to find out what type of historical fiction you want to write. That helps you determine how much you need to research before you start writing, as far as like notes you want to compile and things like that. And it also helps you determine your boundaries and limitations within the world that you are still going to have to world build. And the only real difference is that with historical fiction of any sort, the world building for the most part has been done. Depending on the type of story you're trying to tell, you can add or take away. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Kind of the second part of tip 1 is figuring out the point of view that you're writing from. Are you creating your own character in a specific time period with their own lives and problems and issues that they have to deal with and figure out? Or are you writing from the perspective of someone who actually existed? Those are also things that are going to help you figure out some of those limitations and boundaries, because obviously if it's someone that existed, there's certain things in their life that definitely you have to include in a story about them, because that's kind of the point of historical fiction. One of the fun things of it is finding gaps in history that we don't know all the details, and then using what we do know about the people and events around them to fill in those gaps. That's part of the allure to historical fiction. Take into consideration things like that. Also, like, are you writing about a specific event, and just like, again, whose perspective are you telling that story from? Why are you choosing to tell it from that story? Like, think about those things, because that's where you're going to really start finding like the themes that you're trying to get across in your story. At the same time, like if you are creating your own character and just inserting them into a time period, especially if you're writing more historical fantasy, you have a lot more liberty. You still want to do a certain amount of research so that that time period feels authentic, but again, there's wiggle room there. Second tip, this one's going to probably be the most obvious and the one that most people think of. Ideally, know as much as you possibly can about the time period, events, people, etc. that you are going to be writing about in your historical fiction novel. Do as much, if it's not something you know a lot about already, do as much research as you possibly can. Take notes, whatever works for you, but learn that stuff. If it's something that if it's a time period or whatever that you do know a lot about, that's great, but brush up your knowledge and make sure you're super sharp with it before you even get started, because otherwise it's one of those things that can slow down the process when you're actually sitting there trying to write and you're like, oh, what is that type of clothing called? Because In like contemporary fiction, nobody really cares to read about a character getting dressed in the morning. But in historical fiction, certain types of historical fiction, especially, things like that are interesting because they're different. And people who like history usually have some appreciation for how difficult things were back then, or in some ways, how romantic things might have seemed back then, even if in reality they probably weren't. Tip number 3. This one actually I kind of came up with while I was working on. I loved how this worked out for me, you guys. Okay, so again, this is kind of going to depend a little on what type of historical fiction you're telling, but you can still, I feel like, use it to some degree. So basically what I did is I took the time period that I was going to initially set my historical fantasy in, and I basically like Googled a timeline for major events. And in the case of the story I was telling, I was creating my own character to tell it through her perspective. However, it did involve real people and real events, and the character I had created was very close to those real people. So I had a lot of limitations with that. And so I looked up this timeline of that particular historical story, right? And everything that we know about it. And then I went through, and each point on there, I did a little bit of more in-depth research about whatever that thing was, or what was this just something that was being said about so and so, or whatever, right? This kind of stuff. Or, you know, did this not get said until like a century later or something? You know what I mean? Looking into a little bit greater depth with that. And then I took what I had previously written of my initial story concept and like the main things that I wanted to happen, because I was coming from like I was familiar with the historical timeline. So the story that I had in my head was pretty much already like aligned in a lot of ways with that. But then I took that and I combined it with the real historical timeline and kind of started figuring out how to weasel it together, right? From, again, from a character that I had created from her perspective, but involving all this reality that we knew about. It was super fun, y'all. If you are a history nerd to any degree, and you know, obviously, like, writing is just fun in general, right? Like, who chooses to write a novel that doesn't just like want to tell a story? So it was a super fun process. For mine being a historical fantasy, I was incorporating like myths and folk tales of that time period into the actual story. So that created even further limitations for me in various ways. But it was also really fun because the story I had chosen historically, there was a lot of like stories about, you know, curses and witches and fairies and whatever, right? And so finding ways to incorporate that into things that actually happened, it was so fun. Tip number 4. If while you're doing your research, you find certain gaps in like a person's life, again, this is going to depend on the type of historical fiction you're telling, to be fair, but if there's any kind of gaps where we don't know exactly what happened, or we don't, you know, we have like a little bit of knowledge here and there, but, you know, there's always going to be some level of speculation or there's no way to tell a story, even if you're trying to be as true to history as possible, there are going to be points that you have to make up. And for me, like, I feel like it kind of relates to creating any character yourself. If even if you are trying to write from the perspective of someone who actually existed, the more you research about that person, find ways to kind of almost like emotionally connect with them, and the more that you practice writing from their perspective and have thought about their story and their life and what they actually lived through in a not textbooky kind of way, you will empathize with them in the same way that as a writer you empathize with characters that you create yourself, right? They become real to you as if you actually knew them in person to some degree. So try to empathize with that character, whether you make them up or they're real, but try to empathize with them based off of what we know about that time period and what their life would have been like. And I guess that seems, saying it out loud, it sounds very like, oh, duh, that's what you want to do with any character you write from, right? But I guess I especially mean that when it comes to people who are real. There's been some historical fiction books that I have read that I feel like are very unfair to certain historical figures. Whether it's a historical figure that I personally like or would have agreed with or not, I still think that sometimes people turn them into caricatures or just like only look at one perspective of them. And so I don't know, the way that you would with any character that you write, try to view those historical figures in the same way and make them whole people, you know. Tip number 5 pretty much is just an extension of what I was just talking about. Find contradictions in how certain people or events or whatever it is that you're writing about. Find contradictions in those things and try to write from either a middle perspective, depending on, I guess, like the POV that you're writing in, of course. Either tell it from like a middle perspective and let both sides be heard, or maybe choose a side that hasn't really been heard before or that is really misunderstood or that you personally feel like has been misunderstood. And that's part of the fun of historical fiction of any sort, is exploring things like that. Always remember also, please, that if you are writing about different cultures or religions, or really just be gentle, right? Be considerate of people. Make sure that you have beta readers that are of, like, if you're writing of different ethnicities or whatever from yourself, make sure you have beta readers that are of that heritage in whatever way. I love fiction of any sort in the way that like you can step into somebody else's shoes and experience things from a very different perspective. I love that. I think that's one of the things that most people appreciate about stories. One of many, right? But at the same time, like, you can never actually fully understand somebody else's perspective. So just keep that in mind. Make sure that you're respectful. Make sure you do your research and make sure you represent people as people. Like, history is definitely messed up, but if you are going to be talking about some of the messier aspects of history, then make sure you are doing it in a way that is not too that's not just for shock value, that is respectful. I'd say the same thing when it comes to, you know, sexism and things like that. You know, you don't have to have gratuitous, violent essay scenes in there just because, oh, well, that was the time period. You know what I mean? Like, if negative things happen, and negative just doesn't feel like a strong enough word, but if horrible things happen in the time period or the story that you're trying to tell, be respectful about it. And yes, you can tell it from a modern perspective, but also keep in mind the perspectives of the people in that time period, so that if you're telling it through their heads, you can still do that thing where you pull the reader into, like, in this time period, yeah, this shocking thing was happening, but it was normal for them. Imagine what that was like. And that encompasses a lot of horrific stuff in history. But like, again, that's one of the things that I personally love about historical fiction, is being someone who loves history. I want to know, like, what were people thinking? Like, how was this normal for people? Or, you know, whatever, like those kinds of questions. I'll probably at some point have to make a totally separate video talking about like being respectful to other cultures and ethnicities and religions and genders and whatever, because that's a whole topic unto itself. But I just wanted to throw that little note in here, because, yeah, history is messy and complicated. If you have any tips that you have come across while writing your own historical fiction, or just ideas, whatever that you'd like to share, please let me know in the comments below. I love to hear any advice that I can come across myself. Like I said, I do plan on writing more in the historical fiction genre at some point in my life. But yeah, I would love to hear y'all's perspectives on these things. And thank you so much. Again, thank you to all my subscribers. Please like, share, subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see y'all very, very soon.